And let me see what happens with this. This is about somewhere between 1.5 and 2 minutes long, so please bear with me because hopefully it'll make a point. And you might get a chuckle out of it, who knows?
Tonight, I'm obsessed with the things President Trump knows better than anyone. First and foremost, as we learned today, he knows more than everyone on Wall Street.
I don't think there was one Wall Street genius, of which I know many of them, but they're not geniuses. There's not one that predicted anywhere close to these job numbers. I thought they were going to be good.
Not just Wall Street, though. Oh, no, it's way more than that.
I know more about the other side than almost anybody. I know more about steelworkers than anybody that's ever run for office.
I know more about contributions than anybody.
I know more about politicians than anybody. I know more about courts than any human being on earth. I know more about renewables than any human being on earth.
I understand money better than anybody.
I understand it better than anybody. I know more about drones than anybody. I know about every form of safety that you can have.
President Trump says he knows more than anybody, with apparently...
So I'm going to move on from that on the grounds that hopefully it's made the point. If I can get back to where I want to go, which is there. So moving on, we are not Trump, and therefore we're not stating that we know more than any of you. And so the major purpose of today is to ask you questions to make sure that we're on the right track. Because we know that there is an enormous amount of knowledge and advice and suggestions and thoughts out on the internet, so that when people, very busy parish clerks or whoever, come out to look for a question, they can't get a quick answer. And our mission is to enable the busy users to get the information that they need in just a few mouse clicks. And the way they're going to do that is through the Great Collaboration's knowledge base. And so today's questions are to ask you to help us get onto the right track with the knowledge base. So first question I've just asked you, can you please help us ensure that we've got the right information that you're going to be looking for? The second one is to say, are there ways of automatically mapping some of the data that we answer that's common to all participants and thereby spare them the effort of putting it onto the map? And we'll discuss that. And then one of the ways I thought we might just give as an example this morning of how to identify this data is to consider a very simple path that a very small council might follow to achieve their goals. So just the way that this works, the system is recording this session, and Zoom has got some AI built into it, which provides us with a written record of everything that's put down into the chat, including the links that people very helpfully put there. And they also give us a written record of what's been said and who said it. Which is particularly applicable in the Q&A session, since lots of people are coming in with different questions. But it's a lot of speech to go through later. So what I'm hoping to ask you all is that the more information that you can put into the chat session with an accompanying link, that would really help the AI and reduce the workload on the people at this end. So it's quite common for people to type something into the chat because they've just heard something being said and the link is relevant to that comment. But of course, when we look later at the chat, we have no idea what the comment was that triggered your thought in the first place. So as a suggestion, it's much more helpful to put that carbon copy includes climate change, climate policy, climate science, climate impact at that address than just putting in the address. So if I could ask people to please try introducing a bit more verbiage, no, that's the wrong word, words than we usually get in the chat session, because that helps the AI make sense of it and be able to find it later. And we're going to introduce the idea, which we'll see later on in more detail, about getting to include keywords when you're writing links in, because again, that will sort out how we find your links later. So if you apologize for the fact that we're trying to get robots to do the sorting at our end, and whatever you're doing will be helpful towards that. So that's how we're going to run today, I hope. The way we're going to run it is just to give a very simple path, because it will give you some idea of the enormity of the exercise that we're doing on the whole project. We're going to come up with a list of ideas that come out of that path. And then I'm going to just give a demonstration of how Parish Online, our selected mapping system, can automatically map data for us, which will save a lot of work. But then the question comes of what do we want to do that with? And hopefully, in the discussion at the end, the Q&A session, you'll come up with many more paths that parishes can be following or have followed, and what they've generated on the way. So let's suppose that there is a council that says we're going to declare a climate emergency. That's our first decision. And then everyone says the second thing you need to do is to create a climate action plan. So then we hope that they will go into the knowledge base, type in climate action plan, and they'll get the advice of how to create one, because everything that I've seen shows that governments and very large companies are all dictating from the top down as to how we should solve the climate crisis. And all the evidence that I'm seeing is that things work much more effectively if everybody is in agreement that what they're doing is what they want to do. It's appropriate for their particular community, and they've chosen to do it, so you get the buy-in and the volunteers to actually do the work. So having made a decision as to have a plan, then what puts the plan into operation are the local folks. And there's no question that getting the community together to create the plan in the first place is hugely more successful. And I've given a couple of examples there. The workshops that CCA runs in the form of Jules and his team have, I think, been really inspiring. You can really sense the enthusiasm in the room when you're looking at the videos of the workshops that he's holding. We had a presentation last year from the Hay Community Resilience Initiative, which again was something that was built entirely by involving everybody in the local community, and that took off like wildfire. Well, that's a bad phrase to use today, isn't it? But anyway, and transition towns, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that phrase, but there are places all over the world now, but following the example of Totnes in South Devon, which said, why are we paying attention to what we're told to do by the government, whether that government be the national government, whether it be the county council, whether it be the district council? We're a town. We want to run the town the way we want to live. Let's do it. And they started this with, they sort of gave themselves the title of a transition town. They were transitioning from effectively national government, far away remote government, to local government, and the results have been spectacular, to the point where this is now being adopted around the world by people who've been inspired by what they've seen. So in the same way, I'm saying that I hope everybody will work on a community basis going upwards rather than a directed basis going downwards. Oops, sorry. So that's all that our little parish council has done in the first instance. They've declared an emergency and they've created a climate plan. Now I'm going to show you what that involves, or what's involved from our point of view of providing the knowledge base. So the decisions that the meeting may make, I'm just giving you examples here. They may decide they're going to reduce the use of single-use plastics around the community. They all decide they want to reduce energy consumption and lower their electricity bills. And they are going to decide that rather than use energy generated by fossil fuel, they would want to use more renewable energy. So 3 simple, fairly basic decisions made at parish level. What does that mean for us? Well, in deciding they'd like to hold a community workshop in the first place, we need to have examples of them in working. We need to have best practice. We need to have case histories. So 3 examples just from, or rather 3 topics needed just from the decision to hold a workshop. Then their decision to reduce the single-use plastics that they use. They would want to create a policy, but they want to find a policy that's appropriate to their parish size and location. They don't want to rewrite it themselves if somebody else has already done it. But we're now back to the question of where do you find the one that's relevant to you? And then having got the policy, what is the best way from experience, other people who've done it, of actually implementing it? So are there case histories to show? Is there a best practice? Has anybody else near us done this that we can talk to and get their experience of what it's like doing it in our area? So that's the mapping side of life. So just those questions come out of the very first decision to reduce the use of single plastic. If we move on to the second item, which was let's reduce our energy consumption, then you start thinking about, well, we need to have all the information we need about retrofits on public buildings, on private houses and businesses. And I've put listed there because one doesn't think of putting insulation on a listed house as being an issue until someone says, well, you should have double glazing or triple glazing. And then you run into all sorts of issues. So I've listed them there because we need to have information available. People decide they're going to use more public transport. Well, a lot of us live in places where there is little or no public transport of any note. So you may need to talk about setting up your own community minibus. Other people have done this. How can we find out? Ditto for cycle paths, ditto for all sorts of ways of using public transport. How do we get from here to the train station, for instance? I think that no matter, there's a small backlash at the moment in purchasing EVs. I'm sure that well, there's a government edict that we've got to have EVs from the sort of the middle of the next year.
Which potatoes?
So let's talk about charging points. Let's talk about public charging points, private ones, running cables across pavements.
What are you using them for?
Hang on a minute, I need to.
Boiling them, squishing them a bit, and putting them in my masaka.
Need to shut that.
If I would use the red ones, which are out there.
Ian, can you mute yourself, please?
Done it for him. Right. Sorry about that. Let's go back to where we were. Just let me confirm you can still see what on my screen? No, you can't. Share the screen. Okay. So we were talking about the simple decision to reduce energy consumption then generates a lot of knowledge base activity needed. We talked about putting smart meters into houses so they can tell you which is your greatest use of energy and how can you reduce it. Can you go to switching your washing machine and your dishwasher onto off-peak electricity time so that you are reducing your costs because off-peak electricity is less expensive, and you're also hopefully going to reduce the costs of the improvements needed to the national grid. If you're spreading the load so that it doesn't have to carry so much electricity, then perhaps you could spare the £87 billion at the moment they're saying it's going to take to upgrade the grid to necessary standards. And in running any policy within the sort of net zero situation, I think you need to know at least where you're starting from in terms of your CO2 equivalent generation locally. So that means providing an impact tool. There are lots of impact tools. Which one do we use for which community? All those sorts of questions. And then the third question was about we need to we need to get our supply of electricity from a renewable supplier. So who's going to do that? How much is, who provides renewable energy 100%? Are we going to put in more PV? Are we going to put in more wind systems? Are we going to put in communal heat and energy systems? Where's all the information coming from about that? How do you store renewable energy locally so that you can use it during the nighttime or in the windless days? And is there a way of distributing the energy that you generate around your local community rather than having to pump it out into the grid, because that produces all sorts of delays? And finally, this is all going to cost money, so people like to be told where the money is coming from or what's available and whether they can do anything about it. Bear with me 1 second, sorry. There's a guy knocking at the door. Can you just go around the side there? Thank you. So, big pardon. On to the next slide. So, the accumulation of all of that information is going to say that every single item that one discusses needs examples, policies, guides, project plans, best practice, and links to other people doing the same thing. So you can see there's a sizable load on us to find all of those for each outcome that any workshop has, or any parish decides they want information, they're going to come to us with information. We've got to find the information, lots of it. So we need to organize ourselves, and fortunately, Jules has done a wonderful job over Christmas. He got bored twiddling his thumbs, and so he came up with a way of categorizing everything that we're going to be talking about. And I'm just putting these pictures up here to show you that it's a long, long list. So I've given you just 2 slides, but rather than bore you solid, I'll just let you know, and it goes on for a lot further. And this is an example of what the system is going to have to sort data into, and therefore the question arises of how best to do that. And again, we're sort of throwing the questions open to anybody who may have ideas in case we hadn't thought of them ourselves. So if people could put into the chat, just whilst we're going along, answers to what sort of phrases do you use when you're looking for things like climate change and net zero answers on the internet as you head towards your specific goals in your local community. So if we know the phrases that are commonly used, we can adjust our search engines accordingly. That taxonomy, the previous 2 slides of that dense information, would that be available? Would you want it to be available so you can say, this is what I'm searching for, and you know that you're using the right sort of terminology to find the information that you want? And then in due course, we'll be inviting people to log in to the Great Collaboration website. And I would just wonder whether that login at the first time should encapsulate data about you so that you can say, look, I'm calling in from such and such a parish council. We're just 500 houses. We've got 850 inhabitants, and our local skills lie in farming, do-it-yourself, and rewilding. And then that helps make the answers that we provide you with much more relevant and much more appropriate to you, but you don't have to keep entering the same information every time. But you may have to have 2 logins if you tend to log in as head of the parish council at one point and as a local farmer at another, so that your answers will vary according to who you are representing when you log in. So should we be thinking about that? Is my question to you. Then there's the automatic mapping of data, and this is just a demonstration to you now of how this works at the moment, and to ask what you would like it to do in the future as we move on with rolling out Parish Online as the mapping system for Great Collaboration. So the Parish Online page looks like this. Here is where I'm living, and the blue line around the town of Bembridge represent the parish boundary. So if I click anywhere within the parish boundary, it brings up the parish record. This is the database entry for our parish. And you'll notice 2 small things in passing. Just the impact tool, the carbon impact tool from CSE is already built in to Parish Online. So that's a useful facility. It's actually a rabbit hole. You go down there and you get lost for hours because the information it generates is fascinating. I just give you that as a caveat. But in the left-hand column, we have here the questionnaire that is facilitized, if that's a word, in Parish Online. And at the moment, it's set up for gathering council statistics, but of course, we would like it to gather climate change statistics. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this might be used. So moving right on, here is an example of us starting up the questionnaire, which is something that you can do anytime in Parish Online, whenever you've got the moment free to fill in the data. And it might be partially answered by the parish clerk, partially answered by the RFO, partially answered by the chairman or any of the councillors. So it's open to all. It's not tied to a specific person. So it's very straightforward, just invites you to start. And then it asks you a whole bunch of questions in multiple sections. And the sections themselves can have multiple questions, and they can provide suggested answers, and they can provide also helpful suggestions. So, you know, if you'd like to find out more about what the heck a climate emergency declaration is, go here. So you can just see how the status of your particular parish in declaring a climate emergency is answered here. Then, having filled in the questionnaire, all of it or part of it, then you want to see what the results are, and you can see the results on a national basis. So the whole point of this is, how can we find out what's going on around us in the particular specifics that we've declared an interest. Now for today, because we're working on the parish statistics for council information, I've just selected the precept of band D in the country to see who around me is in what sort of precept area. So this is the answer that you get. You can see that there's a color, a code, if you will, assigned to each parish. And the coding here will tell you what the precept is in your particular band, or this is in band D, I'm sorry. And then you can find yourself, you can zoom in and you can say, okay, well, I know that the next door parish is not the same as us, but the one on the other side certainly is. And again, I'm just giving you this as an example of what's there at the moment, but it can be adjusted so to do exactly the same thing on topics that are of interest to us in the Great Collaboration. And part of today's exercise is to ask you, what sort of questions do you think could go into a climate change questionnaire in Parish Online? So the beauty of this is that the results get posted automatically at the parish level. So when you're filling in information in Parish Online, you don't have to do the mapping on these questions, at least, which is a great time saver. So then my question today is, what sort of questions do you think we should ask in the climate change questioning facility in Parish Online? And I'm just giving some examples here that if you're looking to work on a project and you'd like to find out who around you is doing it, would that be community heat pumps? And would you say, do I want to know who hasn't started or is thinking about it, who's actually in the middle of it, or who's completed, so we can ask them, how did it go? Ditto for solar farms, ditto for climate action plans, and ditto for any other questions that you guys would like to see visible on the mapping when you get going on your climate change work. So I sort of get to the end of my presentation now and say, these are the questions I've asked really in today's session, and to which I hope that we can now open up the floor for answers or to go through what's already been put into the chat system. But if people would like to discuss typical ways in which they ask questions so that we can find the appropriate answers or find ways of getting you the information that you're looking for. So I've suggested, you know, are you looking for workshops, policies, plans, strategies, guides, case studies, anything else that you can think of? Ditto on taxonomy. What are the sort of topics that you want to be finding out about? And then we have several pages of those topics, and then they're broken down into categories, various questions, and all sorts of things. So if we produce that text, or we have produced that taxonomy, the question is how best would it be useful to you? And how do we get questions from you in the first place from after today? Are you going to send in chat questions, which is, I think, a wonderful way. It works brilliantly. Are you going to send us emails? I've just thought of a question to which I can't find the answer. Can you help? And then in particular, as we've just discussed, what sort of questions do you think we could answer in that Parish Online question facility? Because it does save a lot of trouble in doing the mapping for us. So now I'm going to come out of this page, go back to the main system, and perhaps Andrew, if you've been monitoring the chat, you can get the ball rolling for us. Dead silence.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. Just a couple of questions already. One which is about whether there is a recommended software to measure carbon emissions at town and parish council level. At the moment, the recommendation of that is the impact tool developed by the Centre for Sustainable Energy and Exeter University. There was another question about it, how up to date is the impact tool? I was under the impression the data is a bit old now. It was updated last year. The data is national data. So what you get from the impact tool is not necessarily a precise image of what's happening in your parish. It can be skewed slightly, for example, if you've got a motorway going through it. But it is what you'll get from the impact tool is at least a list of priorities for your parish council that you can then drill down to.
Yep.
So those are the questions we've had so far.
Okay, well, I've got David's hand up, so can we go to you, please, David?
We've approached it in a slightly different way. Would you mind if I just showed you a few slides?
Absolutely, no, go ahead.
So if I can share.
Mm-hmm.
So you permitted sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I won't go into presentation mode because we can jump backwards and forwards over it. Okay, we're being pretty hardcore and we are looking specifically at how do we drive down emissions, in other words, our CO2 contribution. And whilst there are multiple links with different areas like biodiversity, about tree policy, about various other activities, we've been fairly hard-nosed to try and keep it absolutely focused on a particular output. We use the concept that is used in fairly high-level planning, campaign planning, which is the biggest and most fundamental bit of any part of planning is to understand what the hell you're dealing with. And where I see great collaboration, your website is absolutely pivotal to making that bit work. And no matter at what level you're thinking and trying to understand it, you will need levels of detail, which is actually quite challenging to get hold of. So one of the questions I challenged Hart was, so what are we trying to achieve? So, what is our carbon output? And actually, Hampshire had already done some work, and it's been refined for the Hart district. So we're looking at a total of 485 kilotons of CO2 for our district, of which about 49 is sequestrated by plant. The rest is actually driven into the atmosphere and goes into the sea and does whatever it needs to do. So that's the first question is, and Andrew, you were already alluding to it, and the question is, what are we generating? And whilst it can be done at county and at district levels, much more challenging at the parish town council, because ultimately what we want to try and do is identify what impact we're making at a parish level.
Yep.
So there needs to be some sort of tool or something that allows us to not only work out what our target is, but actually somehow monitor progress. What we've then done is we've divided that into a series of areas. So you can see on the screen waste management, agricultural, public sector, industrial and commercial, household and domestic, and transport. And the pink lines are for the county as a whole, and the blue is for our particular district. And the other graph on the same page is about what is it we can influence, because I think we have to be realistic. And each tier of local authority has responsibility for particular areas. And so there's no point in a parish council trying to, unless it particularly wants to, drive down looking at transport, for example, because actually that's a national policy issue. We can make a little indent into it in terms of EV points and maybe providing local power. But in terms of moving everybody onto EV or non-CO2 producing vehicles, that's outside of a parish council to deal with. So it gives us an option to say, right, what is it we're going to address and how we're going to address it? Sorry, hang on to your hats, boys and girls, because this gets a bit complicated now. Now, this is at a district level coming down to parish level. So we've looked at the Hart County Council. Now they're already doing lots and lots of good stuff to try and drive down their carbon footprint. So forget about that. So we looked at the domestic sector, which is something that we as parish councils can easily get our teeth into. And what we've also been is very pragmatic in the sense that we can't do everything at once. Let's deal with what we can do. And when we've got that pretty much sorted, let's move on to the next thing, unless there is a relationship between a particular sort of work stream and another. So, for example, local green power generation, if you look at the pink arrow, has an influence on everything. And actually is one thing that we need to get in and going fairly quickly. And if you notice the big area here, there's a bit of work that needs to be done and information in terms of the relationships between what we're trying to do and other big areas like biodiversity, like tree strategy, like national policy. All sorts of things need to be done. And there are different mapping tools you can use to try and do that. So if we now just look at the domestic, if we now focus purely on the domestic sector, we've broken down what we want to try and achieve there in terms of a logical approach. So the first thing we want to do is, which houses do we need to spend time and effort on? That's number one. Number two is, of those houses that we need to spend off it, how much do we need to actually focus on their insulation issues? And then we've got things like, how do we replace gas boilers? And then how do we upgrade those that are using electrical systems? And if you notice, local green power generation comes out yet again pretty strongly. So moving back into Parish Online, so if we take this issue about how do we improve that? So the first thing is about doing that. So that's our parish, and that is the EPC scores across the parish. It's incredibly helpful. And unfortunately, as Tristan and I, just before Christmas, were delving this in a bit more detail, it looks okay, but actually what isn't shown is there are lots of properties with no EPCs at all, because they've been in a single ownership for so long. They've been owned before the EPCs came out. So one of the big pieces of work that we're going to have to do, the so what from this, is that we're going to have to visit, engage with the houses that have no EPC and try and persuade them to get an EPC or some form of energy measurement. And that then raises a question of, how do we pay for it? Because if some well-meaning chap turns up at my doors and says your EPC is out of date, and I'll go, oh, thank you very much, that's very interesting. we'd like you to upgrade it. And I'll go, okay, how much is that going to cost? And a lot of us would just go, okay, I'll think about it. So unless we've got some form of funding, how do we move that forward? So that actually turns into an action plan for just getting our SAP scores up to speed within the parish. And this is a draft. It's it's not fixed. Probably needs a bit of a scrub, but it gives us the structure upon which we can actually just look at that first stage. And so moving on to what sort of information do we need? So if we're looking at SAP scores, where do we get that from? Tristram's doing some work on Parish Online for me to be able to produce a spreadsheet so that I can then have a list of all those houses that have no EPC or EPCs out of date, which means that I can then fire up my team that don't exist yet, notional team, to be able to go out and knock on people's doors and engage with people to see if we can get that, as long as we can find some funding from somewhere. The next bit of question is, and this is where your website again becomes incredibly important, of the areas where we're losing heat, which are the best areas we focus on? And there's some very good work done by UCL, the Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering, where they've actually looked at the payback periods for the type of insulation. And there is some insulation that is absolutely worth doing. But then the next question is where are the grants? Who's going to pay for this? How do I get it done? If you and so you can see on the slide there where you're basically it's cavity wall insulation, loft insulation. The rest of the other types of insulation, particularly for very much more older buildings with single skin builds, doing solid wall insulation is actually incredibly expensive, and actually the payback period is probably not worth doing. So, these are the sorts of debates that we can actually have. But having that on your website to be able to look at that type of data is really important. And when you're trying to persuade people what best form of insulation they should be trying to achieve, and also which would be quite helpful within how do you manage the energy loss? There's the EPC is not particularly accurate. It's an idea. Are there other technologies that we might be able to link in with other universities that actually gives us a much more real-time view of how well our houses are insulated? Now, the other thing that I've been speaking to Tristram about is that there is a firm about to resend 2 satellites up next year, or this year actually, that does infrared analysis over the UK. And so I've already written to the company, and they could literally identify the infrared output on a house by house output on a house by house basis. Or we could use drones, or we could use whatever, but that would give us another indicator of how well we're insulated. So first step is to try and stop losing heat. And the next thing is about how do we make generation of heat as efficient as possible. There then needs a whole bit of work to be done in terms of developing an action card on insulation, so that there's some work that needs to be done there. But the other big area that I've kept alluding to is about the generation of local generation of energy. Because anything that we want to do, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's infrared, whether it's other forms of storage heaters, all depend on electricity in order to make it work. And so Tristan and I are doing some work with on the CSGO project about how do we generate local energy. And there's a whole there's a huge area of information needed there, Graham, in terms of how we pull all that together. What is the most efficient way of doing it? And when you just look at solar panels alone, the technology is exploding at a phenomenal rate, and trying to corral that into something that's sensible. because we could almost do with a which guide to the best technology to use at a given point in time, because a lot of it's experimental. Some of it's very mature, but not that efficient. So it's that sort of stuff that we need in order to make sort of decisions at scale in order to make a difference. So this is an approach where if we carried on, we could logically identify a lot of the other areas where you need information. So if we go back into this space here, for example, so we've got SAP scores, there's a whole bitch about how you do it. How do we use Parish Online? How do we produce the spreadsheets and the list to go out and get people to engage? Where do we get funding from? What's the best way of getting money to do that? Then there's the whole bit on insulation. What's the best form of insulation? How best to do it? I know, listening to some of the collaboration talks we've had, when they were talked about insulation, the biggest problem, which was a real, it was a barn door obvious statement, but actually until someone actually said it on one of your presentations, it's about people often put a lot of rubbish up into their attics to get rid of it, or to store it. How do you move it in order to get the insulation? Because often we're dealing with very elderly people who have got no interest or desire to empty their loft or move the stuff in their loft, and they don't have the ability to do it. So there is some stuff there about pulling in the information that you've already gained from these great speakers that you've had. We've got replaced gas boilers. I've deliberately not put air source heat pumps because I'm a bit of an air source heat pump skeptic. I'm incredibly keen on some form of technology, but we need to look at technologies where we can replace gas with something. Don't know what it is, but there's a lot of work to be done to pull that together. Electrical systems are relatively straightforward. A lot of people still use just straightforward immersion heaters, particularly fairly elderly people who've not really engaged in this for decades. And there's some work we could do to support that with modern timers and different things. So that's relatively straightforward. So yeah, if we wanted to use a sort of technique like this, we could really dig through each of the pathways and identify where at parish and town council we have a responsibility, and then identify those areas for which we don't have a responsibility, we'd like to engage with, support perhaps, but not necessarily. So it gives us very clear boundaries, which makes suddenly it workable and doable, as opposed to trying to handle a hugely complex area for which most of us don't have the resources in terms of manpower and expertise. Anyway, I'll shut up now and hand it back to you, Graham.
Well, David, I think you've made all sorts of points much more succinctly than I did, which is to show that there are people out there who are developing the splendid sort of plans and guides on how to do things. I'm sure a lot of people would love to have a copy of this presentation of yours. And then the question is, we need to be able to say, can you put it somewhere on a site that we can access it, or can we borrow a copy of it and we'll make it accessible to everybody? But these are all exactly the questions I was hoping to get asked and answered during the question and answer session. So you set a wonderful example. Thank you very much.
Actually, Graham, answering part of that, what I'd like to do is to turn this into a focus for discussion. So perhaps some of the collaboration periods are not necessarily being talked at, but actually engaged in terms of brainstorming through and working through. So rather like in the old days when we used to have Windows used to be installed on your system, you used to have a wizard that would guide you through. It would be rather nice to have a sort of a net zero wizard that allowed you to be guided through, but was adaptable and could be shaped to meet the needs of different parishes and towns, because we're not all built the same, we're all unique. There are core things that are the same, but there are things that will be unique and different, and we need to be highly adaptable to make sure that we can shape ourselves to the needs of individual parishes and towns.
Yeah. Well, I think you've just opened up a whole new can of worms for the Great Collaboration to look into. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Tristram.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, David. That was very useful. I've got a bit of a problem about the concept that the Great Collaboration knowledge base will contain all the answers that everybody needs for everything, because it's like the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a massive task, and you need a lot of expertise. So I'm wondering whether the first thing, if you think of an individual parish, the first thing I think the parish always needs to do is to do the sort of analysis that David's just talked about, and identify where the biggest gaps are, where they can take effective action. So you need to work out where your biggest bang for your buck comes from. And I think for most parishes that will be, just as David said, in retrofit of insulation, and even more important, renewable energy. But then I think in the knowledge base, what I would like to see is expert companies or institutions who can advise. And I think that the private sector, there's going to be, there's a lot of commercial interest, of course, in doing this work. So when we're doing things like the CSCO project, they, as part of their service, they gather, because they're experts in the field, they know which technologies work. They can advise on which panels. They give you all the stats and everything. But so I see a parish's job is trying to engage people who can support the parish in doing the detail, rather than the parish councillors trying to become experts in every field, which is just too difficult. So I just thought that's a useful thing, I think, to say that I expect these answers again to be provided in the end by commercial companies supported by government loans. And by the way, they will also be the experts on how to get the loans out of the wherever they're coming from, and support the parish in that way.
Yeah, but all that you say is true. I agree with you, and I agree with you that we are not intending to reinvent the wheel ourselves. We just want to point people to the best places to get the information that you're seeking. And in one of them, I imagine there's all sorts of dangers involved in our making recommendations, but I suggest that you could point people to the right places on Trustpilot or something, just as a way forward. But yeah, anyone got any more questions they'd like to ask verbally, please, as opposed to the ones we've got in the chat session? I must say, Liz in Charlbury, I'm going to be on the phone to you shortly to say, when are you going to make a presentation to us all about what you're doing? Because it looks absolutely fascinating. So.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Great.
Thank you.
Bit of a discussion in the chat going on about taxonomy, Graham, as to how I appreciate with the knowledge base that you put in a keyword and it'll bring you up information regardless of where it's stored. But the other question is how do we actually manage that taxonomy when we put stuff in the first place? And as you and I know, there are 2 or 3 different options that are already available to us, one of which is the one that's already on the Great Collaboration website. So sort of subtext of this is what taxonomy are we what headline taxonomy should we say we're going to adopt, knowing in the meantime that the knowledge base will be able to find information by keyword or phrase.
Yes, I was hoping that we'd have either Jules or Chris with us today to think of ways of people contributing information as well, because that's going to have to be automated as much as possible. And that in order to contribute, they're going to want to have the taxonomy so they can make sure that things end up in the right place. So then the question comes, where do you put taxonomy so that they can all use it? I suspect there's going to be a section of the website where you invite people to contribute, and then it comes up and asks them how to categorize the stuff according to the taxonomy. But rather than my blather on, Belinda, I see you've got your hand up. Good day to you.
Hiya. I've just been Dorset Climate Action Network. We are doing a series of carbon literacy workshops for town and parish councillors and community groups. and we finished up early today, so some of us are here. But I was just going to say, was it David, I think, was talking about focusing on, which I don't disagree with, focusing on the things that we can have the greatest impact on, but also not to forget that although we're not the transport planning authorities, I say we, I should change that because I'm no longer a town councillor, but I am still a Dorset councillor. There is a process at the moment for local transport plans being updated for the next 15 years or so, is it? And the government guidance is, and local authority guidance is, that it should be vision-led rather than the old predict and provide model, which was how much do we expect traffic to increase and let's build the infrastructure to accommodate it. That's all now turned round. So we're all being encouraged for a vision-led approach, which I said to my town council, look, if we as the town council are not the people developing the vision on behalf of our residents, then who's going to do it for us? And it took me 4 years of nagging them to get a traffic and travel working group so that we could look at that very issue. And it was kind of, you know, broadly, what do we want our town centre to, how do we want it to look? How do we want it to function? And then we put all of that information together as a broad vision into the local transport plan. And I actually had a meeting with some of the officers involved yesterday to say, now, what is the next stage? How do we as local representatives make the case for you to pay attention to our vision locally? So there is quite an important role, because I feel like if the locally, you know, sort of community-based representatives and community groups aren't thinking about things like design codes in planning, how do we want our places to look? I think there's a huge amount of bottom-up stuff that we could and should be doing, even if we're not, you know, we don't ultimately have the power to franchise the bus network or fund it. You know, we need to be asking for it and defining what it is we want, because they need it as well. They need to hear from the local areas.
Yes, and at the same point, that a lot of that is what I was talking about in the transition towns idea, where people are saying we're not going to leave it to the upper people, we're going to do it ourselves and make sure that our environment and our community is the way that we want it.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is very similar, that people have got to grab the nettle and get on with it. Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. I think well, a number of us have mentioned the issues around engaging local communities, and certainly advice on that is going to be very welcome. We also know that how we get messages out is important at the time being. The other thing that is important, I think, is if we're going to have community climate action workshops, so we're going to get people together to talk about things, absolutely right to get people's priorities. In my village, they wanted the carnival back, but there we go. But it's also important, I think, to temper people's aspirations, because if people say, I want all the shops back, as we can see, there may be all kinds of issues about that. And there are, on the one hand, there are trends in town centre management, but there are also some realities about what is it can work and not work anymore in the world that we're moving into. So I think the value is that, yes, let's engage our community, let's have workshops and think about what can we look forward to. But it seems to me that there's a value also in getting facilitators that can help not necessarily steer the opinions of local people, but manage the workshops and feedback and saying, well, how do you think we're going to achieve that? So we need some people that are able to do that. At the moment, the Society of Local Council Clerks is looking at having some consultancy on to do just that kind of thing. Jules is not here today. Obviously, he does community climate actions from Community Climate Action UK, and there will be other people as we go forward, I'm sure, doing that kind of thing. But I think one of the things we've talked about today is about having links to experts. And I think one of the things that we would like to see are links to people that can facilitate community climate action workshops. I'll add that to the list.
Thank you. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the people who've contributed in the chat. Some of that stuff looks really, really helpful and useful. And I'm going to spend a bit of time going through it with the help of Zoom's AI, see what we can get out of it. And I hope this has been a useful topic for everybody. I'm not sure, Sarah, are you holding a hand up because you want to raise a question? No, okay. Just checking.
Chewing my nail.
I do have one last request for everybody, which is that I've got all sorts of people volunteering to talk to us in the future in terms of February, March, and April. But the last couple of weeks of January at the moment are a marvelous question mark. So if anybody has any ideas of who would be prepared to put on a presentation at quite short notice, I'd love to hear from you, please. Otherwise, I'm going to have to cut with something very dull myself next week and the week after. And you really, really, really don't want that.
Be very afraid.
Yeah, exactly. So the more I can tempt you to make a suggestion, the better, please. And I'm fascinated by the information that's pouring in as we speak on the chat line, which is a grand total of 0. Does anyone else want to raise any more points, please, before we close for the afternoon?
I think this is a topic that will run and run, Graham.
Oh yes, I'm sure there's going to be version 2, version 3, and version 4 as we go along.
All about this.
And oh, fantastic.
We've got a graduate intern coming in to talk with us about messaging and communication and so forth. We're beginning to put some ideas together about that. The person concerned hasn't started work yet, but that in terms of what the baseline is for that particular piece of work, really short of a speaker between now and the end of January, I could cover that point.
So again, I'm very happy to tell you that 50% of the remaining Banter sessions for the rest of this month have already been filled. So thank you very much, Liz. And I'm looking for the other 50% one day of the week. That would be great. Thank you. Thank you all for your time today. Thank you very much for your inputs, and we look forward to the next time. Take care all.
Thank you. Cheers, my friend.